I was an ER nurse for more than a decade, and if there's one thing I can tell you, it's that no 2 days are ever the same. The rhythm of the emergency room is unpredictable, a constant back and forth between chaos and calm, like the sea pulling tides in and out. We worked under the hum of fluorescent lights that never slept, the faint antiseptic bite of bleach and iodine clinging to everything, the sound of monitors beeping at uneven intervals like heartbeats in the air. Some days the calls would pile on top of one another, strokes, car wrecks, overdoses, until the very walls seemed to shake from the weight of it all. Other days, it would be quieter, lulling us into a fragile sense of routine, until inevitably something came crashing in to shatter it. That day began like any other. Morning shift. My shoes squeaked slightly against the polished tile as I walked in, coffee still too hot in the paper cup I clutched, like it was the only thing keeping me awake. We all greeted each other the same way, half smiles, tired nods, small jokes muttered under our breath. That's how you survive in a place like that. You find comfort in routine, in the little details that remind you you're human, and not just a cog in a machine designed to fight death 24 hours a day. The board had its usual lineup: a teenager with a broken arm from a football practice gone wrong, an older man with chest pains waiting for labs to come back, a child with a fever that had scared his mother more than it scared us. I remember thinking that it was shaping up to be a manageable day, the kind where you could breathe between patients. Maybe even finish that cup of coffee before it went cold. We moved as a team, the doctors, the nurses, the techs, each of us slipping into our roles like pieces of a machine. I checked vitals, reassured parents, adjusted IVs, wrote notes with the kind of speed that comes only after years of practice. It was busy, but not frantic. It was steady. In the emergency room, steady is the closest you get to peace. I think that's what made it so hard when everything shifted. It's strange how quickly normal can turn into nightmare. One second, I was standing at the nurse's station, listening absently to the physician cracking a dry joke about hospital food. And the next, the double doors burst open, paramedics rushing in with a gurney. Their voices were clipped, urgent, layered over the mechanical hiss of the portable oxygen tank they'd brought with them. Trauma coming in. Male, late 20s, car accident, unresponsive, BP dropping, pupils sluggish. The world seemed to tilt just slightly. I set my coffee aside. It was still warm, I remember that detail for some reason, and stepped forward to take my place at the bedside. My hands knew what to do before my mind caught up. Gloves snapped on. 4 ready. Monitor leads out. We didn't need to speak much. Our movements were rehearsed from countless traumas before, but this one felt different. There was a heaviness that settled in the air even before I saw his face. When I did, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. His skin was pale, almost ashen, streaked with blood from a gash above his temple. His eyes were half closed, lashes dark against his skin, and he wasn't moving. Just lying there, chest rising only because the bag valve mask was forcing air into his lungs. He looked young, too young, and for a moment in that sterile, overlit room, he didn't look like a patient. He looked like someone who had already slipped too far into the shadows. The trauma bay came alive with noise. Orders were shouted. 4 lines flushed. Blood drawn. The resident called for a crash cart, just in case. I worked quickly, my hands steady, though inside I could feel my pulse hammering against my ribs. We checked his airway, stabilized his neck, started fluids, monitored his oxygen saturation. Numbers flickered on the monitor, stubbornly low, and I kept glancing up at them, willing them to climb. It was still a day like any other, I told myself. We'd seen worse. We'd saved worse. But deep down, I felt the shift. Something about him was different. As we worked, I caught sight of a small detail that lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. A silver ring on his left hand. It was simple, worn smooth at the edges, not flashy, just personal. I thought about how many times he must have twisted it absent-mindedly, or how it must have been slipped onto his finger by someone who cared for him. It was a reminder, in the middle of all the chaos, that he wasn't just a body on a table. He was someone's son, maybe someone's husband, maybe someone's father. That's the part people don't see. To outsiders, it looks like a battlefield. Blood, machines, medical jargon shouted like commands. But for those of us inside, it's the human details that sink their claws into us and never let go. The ring, the photo tucked in a wallet, the way a parent's voice breaks when they say their child's name. Even as we pushed meds and adjusted ventilations, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were racing against something far bigger than blood loss or brain injury. It felt like we were fighting shadows themselves, and the shadows were winning. I've told this story only a handful of times. Even now, it's hard to talk about. Hard because I can still hear the sound of the monitor alarms, sharp and insistent. Hard because I can still see his face, pale under the harsh lights. Hard because that ordinary day was about to turn into something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. And though I wish I could say we saved him, that's not why this case haunts me. It wasn't the trauma alone that scarred me. It was what came after, the part I can barely explain, the part that still makes me question what I saw and what I know. That day began like any other, but it didn't stay that way, and the truth of what happened next still waits for me in the quiet hours of the night, when the hospital corridors in my memory echo with sounds I can't forget. We moved him from the paramedic's gurney to our trauma bed in one smooth lift, the kind of movement that comes from repetition, though the urgency of his condition added a tremor to everyone's shoulders. The monitor lit up as we hooked him in, lines scrolling across the screen in jagged rhythms that told us more than words ever could. His blood pressure was dangerously low, his heart rate erratic. His oxygen saturation refused to climb above the mid-80s, even with full support. It was as though his body had decided it was done fighting long before we even began. The attending physician leaned over him, voice firm. "We need imaging as soon as possible, but stabilize first. IV fluids wide open. Get type and cross for blood. Check pupils." "Right blown, left sluggish," the resident answered, shining the penlight. The words sank into me like stones. That meant brain injury, and not the mild kind. I worked at his side, threading a second line, drawing labs, adjusting the oxygen delivery. My gloves were already smeared red, his blood warm and sticky against the latex, and I could smell that iron tang filling the air, sharper, more invasive than the sterile bleach that usually dominated the room. The paramedics had given us the basics: single car accident, highway speed, vehicle wrapped around a guardrail, no seatbelt, thrown forward into the dash. By the time they got to him, he was unresponsive, breathing shallow. They didn't know how long he'd been like that before someone called it in. We knew all too well that time is everything in trauma, and time was not on his side. "CT as soon as he's stable," the attending repeated. But there was no mistaking the doubt in his eyes. We all knew there was a chance he wouldn't survive the trip down the hall, let alone through the imaging suite. The resident looked at me as we started prepping. "Can you call the family? We need someone here." I nodded, even though my stomach tightened at the thought. That's another part no one prepares you for: the phone calls. The voices on the other end that change forever in the space of a sentence. I found his ID, traced the emergency contact, and made the call. A woman answered. Her voice was light at first, uncertain, and then it broke apart when I told her to come right away. "He was just leaving the house. He said he was going to the store," she whispered. Her words cracked into silence before she hung up, and I stood there with the receiver in my hand, staring at the wall, the weight of her disbelief pressing into me. Back in the trauma bay, his body jerked suddenly, the monitor alarm screaming, "VTASH." For one sickening second, I thought he was going to spiral right there. "Get the crash cart," the resident shouted. We prepped pads, readied meds, and then, just as quickly, his rhythm converted on its own, fluttering back into something tenuous but present. It was as if his body couldn't decide whether to stay with us or let go. We wheeled him down the corridor to CT, our movements swift and coordinated. But the tension was palpable. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered. As we passed beneath them, a stuttering glow that made the hallway feel colder, more mechanical. His monitor beeped with every beat of his heart, a fragile metronome, keeping time with the wheels clattering over tile. Inside the imaging suite, the hum of the machine filled the air as we slid him onto the CT table. I stood close, watching his chest rise and fall under the ventilations, listening to the rhythm of air being pushed into him. The screen began its slow reveal, images of his skull, his brain, each slice telling us more of the story that his silent body couldn't. It was worse than we hoped. Subdural hematoma, significant swelling, midline shift. Words that, in the language of trauma, are sentences more than diagnoses. The attending rubbed his forehead, eyes narrowing as he read the images. "Call neurosurgery, but prepare the family. This is bad." Those words landed heavy. We all knew what they meant. Even if he survived the surgery, the likelihood of meaningful recovery was slim. He was too young, too broken, and we were already running out of time. Back in the trauma bay, I cleaned his face gently, wiping dried blood from his skin, though I don't know why. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was dignity. His ring glinted under the fluorescent light as I adjusted his hand on the sheet. The simple band looked more alive than he did, as if it held his story when his body couldn't. It wasn't long before she arrived, his wife. She came rushing in, face flushed, eyes wide with the disbelief I'd heard in her voice over the phone. She was younger than I expected, hair pulled back hastily, jacket half zipped. "Where is he? Where's my husband?" I guided her to the bedside, my hand on her arm to steady her, though I don't think it was enough. When she saw him, the sound that left her throat was raw, animal. She clutched his hand, sobbing, whispering his name over and over, as if repetition alone could anchor him to life. The attending came in, his expression soft but solemn. He explained the findings, the swelling, the pressure in his brain, the risks of surgery, the reality that even our best efforts might not bring him back to the man she knew. She nodded numbly, but her eyes never left his face. "Do whatever you can," she whispered. "Please, just try." We prepped for neurosurgery, though the silence between us told the truth more than the words did. As we moved around him, adjusting lines, prepping drips, checking vitals, I couldn't help but notice something strange. His numbers would falter, then rise slightly, as if in response to her touch, her voice. Every time she whispered his name, his heart rate lifted just a fraction. His oxygen saturation crept upward. It was subtle, but it was there. "Do you see that?" I murmured to another nurse, and she nodded, frowning. "Yeah, but it doesn't make sense. Medicine doesn't account for love, for presence, for the invisible tether between two people. But in that room, it felt undeniable. For a fleeting moment, it was as though he was fighting to stay, pulled by her voice, her tears, her desperate hope. But deep down, I knew. We all did. There are times when even the most advanced medicine, even the most skilled hands can't pull someone back. And yet, something in him wasn't letting go, not yet. It was that resistance, that strange, flickering pull against death, that made everything that followed so much harder to explain. Because what happened next would stay with me forever. The operating room always feels colder than the rest of the hospital, though maybe that's just the nerves. We rolled him in under the harsh lights, his body looking impossibly small against the expanse of the surgical table. The neurosurgeon was already there, scrubbing in, his face set in the hard mask of someone who has seen far too many battles fought and lost inside the fragile architecture of the human skull. We transferred him onto the sterile drapes, monitors hooked in again, numbers dancing across the screen with a kind of taunting rhythm. His heart rate was steady, blood pressure unstable. Anesthesia worked quickly, though in truth he had barely clung to consciousness since arrival. The ventilator sighed steadily, a mechanical breath standing in for his own. I stood at my usual place near the fourth lines, meds drawn up, chart ready. The OR had its own kind of music, the hum of suction, the click of instruments, the steady beeping of vitals. It was routine, structured, clinical. But beneath the layers of protocol, there was the same unspoken tension we'd carried from the trauma bay, the sense that we were racing against something we couldn't see. The first incision was made, deliberate and exact. The scalpel parted skin, the cautery hissed faintly, and the surgeon's hands worked with the precision of years. They moved swiftly, opening a window into his skull, relieving pressure, searching for the bleed we'd seen on the SOMT. I'd watched countless craniotomies before, but this one felt different. There was a weight pressing down on the room, something heavier than the gravity of the case itself. Minutes stretched into hours, blood transfused, fluids pumped, medications titrated. Every time we gained ground, stabilizing his vitals, stopping a bleed, something else shifted against us. His pressure would spike unpredictably. His oxygen would drop without clear cause. It was as if his body was rebelling, resisting the intervention, slipping in and out of our control. And then it happened. It was subtle at first. His numbers on the monitor began to flutter, not just dipping, but shifting in patterns I'd never seen. Heart rate rising, falling, spiking in arrhythmic bursts, only to steady for a moment when his wife's voice echoed faintly from the waiting area outside. We all froze the first time it happened. "Is that?" one of the anesthesiologists murmured, watching the screen. The neurosurgeon glanced up, eyes narrowing. "It's coincidence. Keep going." But it wasn't just once. It happened again, and again. Every time she spoke his name in the hall, even muffled by 2 sets of doors, the monitor flickered with a response. Tiny, inexplicable, but undeniable. I felt my chest tighten. I've seen families claim patients can hear them, even under sedation, even in comas. But this was different. It wasn't wishful thinking. The machine was showing us, in cold, hard numbers, a connection we couldn't explain. The surgeon pressed on, hands steady despite the undercurrent of unease rippling through the room. He clamped bleeds, relieved pressure, irrigated the swelling tissue. But the deeper he went, the more catastrophic the damage became. His brain had taken a massive blow, swelling against bone, suffocating itself. Every intervention felt like bailing water from a sinking ship. At one point, his blood pressure plummeted so suddenly that alarms shrieked. I pushed fluids, hung another unit of blood, adjusted drips with frantic speed. The anesthesiologist muttered, "We're losing him," under his breath. And then, just as suddenly, his pressure climbed again, spiking unnaturally high. The monitors screamed with the opposite alarm, a warning of pressure too great. It didn't make sense. We adjusted, rechecked, recalibrated. Still, his body seemed to swing wildly, almost violently, as though pulled by forces outside our control. The surgeon cursed softly, his voice muffled under the mask. "This doesn't follow physiology." I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, my hands hovering over the IV lines, because I knew he was right. We had textbooks, protocols, algorithms for trauma, for brain injury, for shock. But nothing explained this. It was as though the body on the table wasn't playing by the rules of biology anymore. The atmosphere in the OR shifted. Even the most hardened among us grew quiet, unsettled. The anesthesiologist kept glancing at the monitor like it was lying to him. A surgical tech's hand trembled slightly as she passed an instrument. None of us said what we were all thinking, that something beyond our training was in that room with us. At one point, his heart stopped. Flatline. The piercing tone of a systole filled the room. We moved without hesitation. Compression started, epinephrine pushed, the crash cart ready. His chest heaved under the force of compressions, ribs cracking faintly beneath the pressure. Minutes passed like lifetimes. And then, without warning, his heart kicked back into rhythm. Not sluggishly, not faintly, but strong. Too strong. His blood pressure surged so fast it sent the monitors into panic, red numbers flashing like sirens. We all stared. It wasn't just revival. It was a surge of life that didn't fit the injury we had seen on the scans, didn't fit the state of his brain, didn't fit anything we knew. The neurosurgeon finally spoke, voice low, deliberate. "This shouldn't be happening." No one disagreed. We stabilized him again, barely, and the surgery dragged on. But in my chest, in that hollow where instinct sits, I knew we were witnessing something we couldn't explain. It wasn't just the fluctuations, or the way his body fought and faltered in impossible rhythms. It was the feeling, the sense that the room itself had shifted, that the walls held their breath, that the shadows in the corners had drawn closer. When at last the surgeon closed, hours later, his movements were slower, wearier. He didn't say it out loud, but the look in his eyes told us the truth. We'd done everything medicine could. The rest wasn't up to us. We wheeled him back to the ICU, his body pale beneath the sheets, machines keeping him alive. His wife was waiting, eyes red and swollen, hands trembling as she reached for him. She leaned close, whispering his name, her voice breaking. And once again, the monitors responded, heart rate lifting by just a few beats, oxygen climbing a fraction. I felt something twist deep inside me. Hope, dread, disbelief, all tangled into one, because I couldn't deny what I'd seen. None of us could. But the worst was still to come. Because sometimes, in medicine, the most haunting moments don't happen under the bright lights of the OR, or even in the frantic rush of the trauma bay. They happen later, in the quiet, when the world expects stillness, and something else answers instead. The ICU was quieter than the trauma bay, but the silence there was heavy, weighted with the presence of machines that breathed and pulsed in place of patients who could not. We wheeled him in under the pale blue glow of monitors, the hiss of the ventilator steady, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, a fragile metronome marking time he no longer owned. His wife was allowed to stay. She pulled a chair close to the bed, taking his hand, stroking it gently, whispering words I couldn't hear. The ring on his finger caught the light as she moved, and again I was struck by that detail. That small, ordinary symbol of connection that somehow seemed stronger than all the machines keeping him alive. We kept him stable through the night. Vitals fluctuated, never quite predictable, but not enough to trigger chaos. The team rotated through, nurses adjusting drips, respiratory therapists checking the ventilator, the attending stepping in periodically to scan the charts. Each of us worked as though our hands alone could anchor him to this world, but each of us knew, in our hearts, that the damage inside his skull was a tide too strong to reverse. Still, he lingered, and with every hour that passed, the atmosphere in his room grew stranger. I don't use words like this lightly, but there was a presence. A heaviness in the air that wasn't explained by grief or exhaustion. Shadows seemed sharper in the corners of the room, the monitors glow colder, harsher. Even the ventilator's rhythm felt uncanny, steady, then faltering, then steady again, as though it were following a pattern beyond our settings. Sometime after midnight, the first event happened. His wife had dozed off in the chair, her hand still gripping his. I was charting at the station when his monitor alarm sounded, heart rate spiking, blood pressure climbing dangerously high, alarms flashing red. I rushed in, expecting to find him seizing or coding, but what I saw froze me in place. He wasn't moving. His body lay as still as before, pale and unresponsive, eyes closed. But the monitor numbers raced upward as though he were in a sprint, his heart hammering at impossible speeds. The ventilator hissed louder, almost forceful, compensating for a demand that shouldn't exist. I called the resident in and we scrambled to adjust. Meds pushed, drips titrated, but the numbers didn't respond. They kept climbing, faster, higher, until suddenly they stopped. Flatline. The alarm screamed. My stomach dropped. We launched into code protocol, compression starting, meds drawn up. I counted under my breath as my palms pressed into his chest, feeling ribs give way under the force. Sweat dripped into my mask as minutes passed. Then, just as in the OR, he came back. The monitor lit up with a strong rhythm, almost mocking in its vigor. Blood pressure rebounded, heart rate steady, as if nothing had happened. We all stood frozen for a second, exchanging glances heavy with confusion. The resident muttered, this isn't possible. But it had happened, and it wasn't the last time. Through the night, his body cycled between extremes. Surges of impossible strength, followed by sudden collapses. Each time we intervened, expecting the end, he came back with numbers that made no sense for his injuries. It was as though something was pulling him back and forth, not letting him go, not letting him stay. His wife began to notice it too. Every time she whispered his name, every time her tears fell onto his hand, the monitor would flicker. The numbers would rise. The machines would respond. She clung to it, convinced he was still there, still fighting for her. But for the staff, the longer it went on, the more unsettling it became. We're trained to trust numbers, to interpret rhythms, to read the signs of the body. But nothing we saw fit the language of medicine. It was like staring at a script written in code we couldn't decipher. Around dawn, the breaking point came. We were standing in his room, me, another nurse, the resident, when his wife leaned close to him, pressing her forehead to his. She whispered, voice trembling but clear, "If you're still here, give me a sign." And he did. Every alarm in the room went off at once, heart rate surging, oxygen saturation plummeting, blood pressure spiking and dropping in rapid succession. The ventilator hissed erratically, as though his lungs were fighting the machine. Lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long across the walls. We rushed to stabilize, shouting orders, pushing meds, trying to wrestle the chaos back under control. But in that moment, all of us knew. This wasn't normal. This wasn't medicine. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The alarms silenced. The monitors steadied. His vitals returned to baseline, as if nothing had happened. His body lay still, unmoving, untouched by the storm that had just ripped through the room. His wife looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Did you see?" He answered me. I couldn't bring myself to respond. My throat felt tight, words trapped behind disbelief. Because I had seen it. We all had. and yet had no explanation to give her. Later that morning, his numbers began to decline steadily, predictably, like the end of a long battle. The neurosurgeon came, reviewed the scans again, and spoke gently with his wife. The damage was irreversible. The machines were only prolonging what his body had already decided. When she finally made the decision to let him go, the room was unbearably quiet. We withdrew the drips, silenced the alarms, turned off the ventilator. His chest rose once, twice, then stilled. The monitor flattened to a single line, and this time it didn't return. His wife sobbed quietly into his chest, clutching him as though her grief alone could anchor him. The staff stepped out, giving her privacy, though the silence outside the door was heavy with the weight of what we had witnessed. I lingered at the nurse's station, staring at the monitor readouts we had printed during the night. The peaks, the surges, the impossible rhythms. Proof of something I still couldn't understand. Proof that the body had responded in ways that defied everything I knew. And it was in that moment, looking at those papers under the cold, fluorescent glow, that I realized something had broken inside me. I had spent years in the ER, balancing the fine line between life and death, telling myself that science, training, and skill were enough. But this case shattered that illusion. Because what I had seen wasn't just biology failing, it was something else entirely. Something that reached beyond the edge of medicine and into the shadows where we have no answers. And that's what haunts me still. I didn't go home right after my shift ended. I couldn't. The hospital hallways felt different that morning, quieter somehow, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened during the night. I walked the corridors in silence, my hands still smelling faintly of latex and antiseptic, even after scrubbing them raw, my body heavier than exhaustion alone could explain. I found myself in the staff lounge, sitting in the corner chair where the light from the vending machine cast everything in a sickly glow. My coffee sat untouched beside me, cold hours ago, and I just stared at my hands. They trembled faintly, though not from fatigue. I had been an ER nurse long enough to see more than most people can imagine. I had watched lives end in seconds, watched miracles unfold against impossible odds, but nothing had ever unsettled me the way this case did. It wasn't just the death. Death, as terrible as it is, becomes a part of the rhythm in emergency medicine. You never get used to it, but you learn to carry it, to make space for it, to keep moving. No, what broke me was the way he lingered. The way the machines told us a story we couldn't explain. The way love, if that's what it was, seemed to reach past sedation, past injury, past the failing body itself. I kept hearing his wife's voice in my head, the way she whispered his name, the way she begged for a sign, the way she was certain he had answered her. I wanted to dismiss it as grief, as projection, as the desperate hope of someone who couldn't bear to say goodbye. But I couldn't, because I had seen the monitors shift, I had seen the machines respond, and I had felt, deep in my chest, that something was in the room with us. In the weeks that followed, I found myself avoiding that corner of the ICU. I'd pass it quickly on rounds, my eyes sliding away from the room where he had died. Some nights, when I closed my eyes, I would hear the alarms all over again. The sudden spike, the flat line, the impossible return. I would wake with my heart racing, convinced for a moment that I was still there, my hands pressing into his chest, ribs cracking under the force. I tried to reason through it. That's what nurses do. We analyze, we rationalize, we find cause and effect. I considered every possibility. Equipment malfunction. We checked and recalibrated everything, more than once. Medication effect. None explained the surges or the timing. Residual brain activity? Maybe, but not to that degree, not in that pattern. And yet, no explanation held. Every time I thought I had found one, I would remember the way his numbers rose when she spoke his name, the way his heart seemed to respond to her voice, even through sedation and swelling. I would remember the storm of alarms that answered her plea for a sign, and I would be left with nothing but silence. There's a part of me that wonders if medicine is too arrogant. We think of the body as a machine, of life as something measured in numbers and scans and blood work. But maybe we've forgotten that there are parts of being alive that no monitor can capture. Maybe the tether between two people, the depth of love or grief, has a weight of its own. Maybe it can pull harder than blood pressure or oxygen saturation, harder than any drug we can administer. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something I'm not brave enough to name. I never told his wife what we saw. I couldn't. I told her the truth as I was trained to tell it, that we did everything we could, that he fought hard, that his last hours were not spent alone. I didn't tell her that the machines seemed to echo her love back to her, that his body defied medicine in ways that made no sense. I didn't tell her that her plea for a sign was answered in a way none of us could explain. Maybe I should have. Maybe it would have comforted her. But it didn't feel like my story to give. Instead, I carried it. And I still do. Even now, years later, I can feel the weight of that night pressing on me. Sometimes when I walk into the trauma bay, the overhead lights hum the same way they did that morning, and I catch myself glancing at the doors, waiting for paramedics to burst through again. Sometimes when I look at a patient's hand, I see that silver ring flashing under the light, and I remember the way it seemed to hold his life more tightly than we could. There are moments in medicine that teach you your limits. Times when all the training, all the skill, all the science you cling to isn't enough. This was one of those times. It forced me to question not just my knowledge, but my faith. In medicine, in explanation, in the boundaries of what we think we know. I still don't have answers. Maybe I never will. But I know this. There are things in the emergency room that science can't explain. Shadows that linger between life and death. Moments that bend the rules we trust so deeply. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. The case will always haunt me, not because we lost him, but because in those final hours, I saw something that made me question the very foundations of what it means to live, to die, and to love. Something that told me the emergency room doesn't just hold the broken bodies of the living. It holds the mysteries of the human soul, flickering under fluorescent lights, forever waiting in the shadows.